Picture this. You're sitting in a crowded room staring at a glowing screen.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Right. You swipe your finger down, a little loading reel spins for like a fraction of a second, and then pop, a burst of new colors, a fresh feed, an alert that someone liked your post. Or, maybe you're in a casino, pressing a button on a machine, watching those digital reels blur into this hypnotic smear of light.
It's the exact same mechanism, really.
Exactly. I mean, you probably use a smartphone every day, right? You might play video games to unwind. You almost certainly know someone who gambles, whether it's sports betting on an app or just buying lottery tickets. But you might not realize how these everyday, seamlessly integrated activities are interacting with the absolute deepest, most ancient parts of your brain.
Because for the longest time, society thought of addiction purely as this chemical equation. A substance enters the body, crosses a physical barrier, and the body gets hooked.
Right, like alcohol or nicotine.
Exactly. But what happens when the drug is, well, just an action?
Which forces a profound shift in how we understand human behavior.
It really does. We are looking at a scenario where you strip away that historical assumption that an addiction requires a physical substance. No chemicals crossing the blood-brain barrier, no syringe, no smoke.
Just the behavior itself.
Yes. Instead, we're relocating the disorder entirely to the brain's own internal reward processing circuitry, exposing how it can basically be turned against itself.
And that is exactly what we are exploring in today's deep dive. We are looking at behavioral addictions, and we've got a massive, incredibly diverse stack of sources driving our analysis today.
It's a great stack.
Yeah, we're pulling from the major psychiatric diagnostic manuals like the DSM and the ICD, along with historical medical papers and some truly mind-bending neuroimaging research. Our mission here is to explore this fascinating conceptual leap. How does a behavior, completely on its own, hijack the brain's reward system?
It's wild to think about.
It really is. And we're going to use gambling as our ultimate case study to map out that hostile takeover. So, okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how a behavior changes the physical brain, we first have to understand how the medical field was dragged, basically kicking and screaming, into changing its own mind about what the word addiction even means.
Right.
Where did the medical establishment stand on this, say, 50 years ago?
Well, if you look back at the 20th century baseline, the medical consensus was aggressively rigid. Addiction strictly meant physical dependence and physiological withdrawal from an external chemical.
So purely biological.
Purely biological.
Okay.
If you stopped taking a drug, your body would mount a violent protest. We're talking about measurable, undeniable physical symptoms.
Yeah.
Tremors, seizures, extreme sweating, dramatic shifts in heart rate.
But body had literally adapted to it.
Exactly. The body had fundamentally biologically adapted to the presence of a foreign substance.
Right.
And removing it caused systemic chaos.
So under that old framework, if you didn't have those physical withdrawal symptoms, like if you were just ruining your life by compulsively betting on horses, you weren't considered addicted in a clinical sense.
Not at all. The medical field viewed you as someone with a willpower problem. It was categorized as a moral failing or a lack of character or just a terribly destructive habit.
Just a personal flaw.
Right. There was no medical diagnosis for it because there was no chemical to point to. But that rigid wall started to crack in the 1970s.
Oh, with Robert Custer, right.
Yes. At a Veterans Affairs hospital in Ohio, a psychiatrist named Robert Custer noticed that compulsive gamblers were exhibiting patterns of self-destruction that looked completely identical to severe alcoholism.
The cravings, the denial, the financial ruin.
All of it. He pushed hard enough to set up the very first inpatient treatment program specifically for compulsive gamblers.
And did the psychiatric establishment actually listen to him?
Well, they listened to the clinical data he gathered, which was pretty undeniable. By 1980, the manual used by psychiatrists to diagnose mental health conditions, the DSM finally recognized pathological gambling.
Okay, so big win.
Sort of. There was a massive caveat. They refused to classify it as an addiction.
Wait, really? Where do they put it?
They filed it under impulse control disorders.
Huh.
Yeah, it sat right next to pyromania. The compulsion to start fires, and kleptomania, the compulsion to steal.
It seems like they were clinging to the chemistry as a safety blanket. Like they couldn't let go of the drug aspect.
Exactly. The medical establishment was willing to acknowledge that compulsive gambling was a legitimate psychiatric disorder, but they simply could not stomach the idea of calling it an addiction without a chemical substance in the mix.
So how do we get from impulse control problem to recognizing that a behavior itself can be a true addiction?
That conceptual leap happened in the 1990s. Researchers, particularly Isaac Marks, started pointing out a glaring double standard. The medical field was treating substance dependence as this deeply biological medical condition, while treating other destructive, out-of-control behaviors as mere character flaws.
Which doesn't make sense if the outcome is the same.
Right. So researchers published papers arguing that non-chemical behaviors were producing a genuine addictive syndrome. It wasn't about what you ingested, it was about the functional role the behavior played in your life.
And this led to a new framework for how we measure addiction, right? Mark Griffiths and the components model.
Yes. A new components model of addiction was formalized in the late 90s, proposing that any addiction, whether it's heroin or a slot machine, creates the exact same pattern in a person's life.
Instead of a checklist of physical symptoms, it's like a narrative of a takeover.
Perfectly said. First, the activity becomes the most salient thing in your life.
Meaning it just takes over.
It completely dominates your thoughts, your feelings, your behavior. Even when you aren't doing it, you're planning the next time you can.
Right, the salience.
Yeah.
And then there is the mood modification aspect. The person isn't just doing it for fun anymore.
Exactly. They're doing it to self-medicate. They need the behavior to get a rush, or conversely, to completely numb out and escape their reality.
And then comes tolerance, just like with drugs.
Just like a drug user needs a higher dose to feel the high, the gambler needs to make riskier bets. $10 doesn't do it anymore. Now it has to be 100, then 1,000.
Wow. And if they try to stop,
They experience real psychological withdrawal, extreme irritability, moodiness, even physical agitation.
which inevitably leads to the fallout,
The conflict.
severe conflict. The behavior starts destroying their interpersonal relationships, their career, their finances. They're lying to their spouses, stealing from their employers.
And then the final component is relapse.
Right.
Most heartbreaking one, yeah. They recognize the destruction, they swear they will never do it again, they stop for a week or a month, and then they fall right back into the cycle.
Hey, hold on. I have to interrupt here for you listening because looking at that pattern, I mean, couldn't I be diagnosed as addicted to running?
Mhm.
Or like collecting vintage books? I mean, reading dominates my thinking. I buy way too many books, so there's a financial conflict, and I get incredibly irritable if I don't have time to read.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Where is the line between an intense hobby and a disease? Does a behavior actually change the brain physically, or are we just using the word addiction as a really dramatic metaphor for habits we don't like?
That is the most important question to ask. Because if this is just a metaphor, the whole medical concept completely collapses.
Right.
But the answer is, it is absolutely not a metaphor.
Mm.
It is measurable structural neurobiology. What's fascinating here is that at its core, behavioral addiction is a problem of human reinforcement learning that has been hijacked.
Hijacked by the behavior.
Yes. To understand this, we have to look at the brain's reward system, which evolution built to keep us alive.
Because our ancestors needed motivation to go find food and survive.
Precisely. When an early human did something beneficial for their survival like foraging for calorie-dense food, finding fresh water, or successfully mating a region deep in the brain called the ventral striatum would release a neurotransmitter called dopamine.
And dopamine is the pleasure chemical, right?
It is, but it's not just pleasure. It is a learning signal.
Yeah.
It's a chemical that tells the brain, whatever you just did was fantastic for our survival. Remember exactly how you did it and do it again.
It's the brain rewarding itself. Good job. Here is your chemical treat.
And chemical drugs of abuse like cocaine or opioids bypass the actual behavior. They are essentially chemical cheat codes that artificially flood that survival system with a tsunami of dopamine.
But behavioral addictions don't have that outside chemical.
They don't. They converge on the exact same circuitry, but they exploit the reward system's own learning rules. And the most effective way to exploit that system is through unpredictability.
Which brings us to B.F. Skinner and the psychology of reward schedules. Like, if I go to a vending machine, put in $1, and press a button, I know a soda is going to drop. It's a completely predictable reward.
Right.
If the machine breaks and stops giving me soda, I'm not going to stand there feeding it dollar bills for 3 hours. I learn very quickly that the reward has stopped.
But imagine a vending machine where you put in $1 and sometimes you get a soda, sometimes you get nothing, and sometimes you get 50 sodas at once.
That would be insane.
You never know which press of the button will result in a jackpot. In the mid-20th century, behavioral psychologists discovered that this specific setup, what they called a variable ratio schedule, produces the most intense, persistent behavior of any learning system.
Because you can't predict it.
Because the reward is unpredictable, your brain becomes obsessed with trying to solve the pattern. And because you never know if the next try is the lucky one, the behavior becomes highly resistant to extinction. Even if the machine stops paying out completely, your brain tells you, just one more try. The big one is coming.
And a modern electronic slot machine is quite literally a variable ratio schedule engineered out of metal, glass, and microchips.
Exactly.
You pull the lever or push the button, and you have no idea if you're going to lose your dollar or win 1,000, so you just keep pushing.
Yes. But modern machines go much further than simple unpredictability. The neuroimaging studies in our sources reveal exactly how deep this cognitive hack goes.
The Luke Clark study from Cambridge.
Yes. Researchers put people inside fMRI machines, brain scanners, and had them play a simulated slot machine. They wanted to see what happened during a near miss.
A near miss is when you get two matching jackpot symbols on the pay line, and the third jackpot symbol lands just like one fraction of an inch above the line. You can see it. It was right there.
So
But mathematically, you lost. Your wallet is lighter. You get $0. Logic dictates your brain should register that as a failure.
logic dictates that, yes. But that is not what the brain scanners showed. When players experience those near misses, the reward regions in their brain's areas, like the striatum and the insula, flared up in a pattern that looked almost indistinguishable from a genuine win.
Wait, really? The brain was chemically treating almost winning as a reward.
Exactly.
That is wild. It's like having a metal detector that is deliberately miscalibrated. You're sweeping it over the beach looking for gold. It starts beeping frantically. You spend 20 minutes digging a massive hole, totally exhausted, only to find a piece of chewed-up tinfoil.
That's incredibly frustrating.
But instead of the metal detector realizing it made a mistake, it plays a victory song, encouraging you to keep digging for more tinfoil.
That is a perfect analogy. The brain's reward system is screaming, we are getting closer. We are mastering the environment. Even though the odds on a slot machine are totally randomized and haven't changed at all.
It's a complete illusion.
A near miss is just a loss wrapped in the illusion of progress. And the cognitive tricks get even more sophisticated when you look at multi-line slot machines.
Right. These are the machines where you aren't just betting on one line across the middle. You can bet on 20 or 50 different zigzagging lines on a single spin.
Researchers studied these machines to understand a phenomenon called losses, disguised as wins, or LDWs.
Okay, how does that work?
Let's say you bet $1 total, spreading it across 20 different lines. You spin, the machine erupts into a sensory celebration, bells are ringing, lights are flashing, celebratory music plays. The screen tells you that you won on one of those random lines, and it deposits 60 cents into your account.
But wait, if I bet $1 and the machine hands me back 60 cents, I just lost 40 cents, it is a net loss. My bank account is going backward.
Exactly, it's a loss. But the researchers didn't just look at the math. They measured the players' physiological responses. They tracked their skin conductance, which measures the microscopic amounts of sweat on the skin that indicate physical arousal and excitement.
And what did they find?
When players experienced these losses disguised as wins, their bodies registered physical arousal spikes that were identical to real, profitable wins.
Think about that for a second. Think about the physical rush you feel when your phone buzzes in your pocket with an important notification. Your heart rate ticks up, your focus sharpens. The slot machine is engineering that exact physiological rush, throwing a massive sensory party while quietly draining your wallet.
It's incredibly effective.
The lights and sounds bypass your logical prefrontal cortex, which is too slow to do the math in real time. By the time you realize you lost money, your dopamine system has already logged a victory.
It is brilliantly designed to hack human physiology. But if you want the ultimate undeniable proof that this is a neurochemical phenomenon and completely divorces addiction from the concept of poor character, we have to look at how we treat Parkinson's disease.
This part of the research blew my mind.
This is perhaps the single most striking piece of clinical evidence we have.
Because Parkinson's is fundamentally a dopamine problem, isn't it?
Yes. Parkinson's disease involves the progressive death of dopamine-producing neurons in the brain, leading to severe motor tremors and rigidity. To treat this, neurologists prescribe medications called dopamine agonists.
And what do those do?
These drugs essentially flood the brain with synthetic dopamine to replace what is missing, restoring the patient's motor control.
Okay, so a patient with Parkinson's takes this medication, their tremors subside, they get their movement back. What does this have to do with behavioral addiction?
In clinical studies, a noticeable subset of these patients, people who have lived 60 or 70 years with absolutely zero history of addiction, people who have lived frugal, disciplined lives, suddenly develop severe, explosive, compulsive behaviors.
Out of nowhere.
Completely out of nowhere. We're talking about sudden onset compulsive gambling, uncontrollable shopping binges, or intense hypersexuality.
Wow.
Clinicians call it dopamine dysregulation syndrome. There are documented cases of retirees who take this medication for their hand tremors, go to a casino for the first time in their lives, and gamble away their entire life savings in 3 winks.
That is terrifying. But what happens when the doctors realize what is going on? Do they send them to therapy?
No, they adjust the dosage. When the neurologist lowers or stops the dopamine agonist medication, the compulsive behavior completely vanishes.
Overnight.
The gambling stops overnight. The patient returns to their normal self, often horrified and traumatized by what they just did.
Which proves the chemistry is driving the bus.
This proves undeniably that a specific neurochemical mechanism is causing the addictive symptoms. It's the exact same person with the same personality, the same moral compass, and the same willpower. The only difference is how their dopamine receptors were being artificially stimulated.
That completely shatters the idea that addiction is just a moral weakness. But it raises a question. If the reward system is getting hijacked by dopamine, why doesn't the logical, rational part of the brain eventually step in and say, stop, you are losing your life savings, we have to go home?
Right, where's the logic?
Yeah, why does the decision-making hardware fail so spectacularly?
To answer that, we turn to a famous piece of neurobiology research called the Iowa gambling task. Neuroscientists wanted to understand how humans weigh short-term rewards against long-term consequences.
Okay.
They brought participants into a lab and sat them in front of 4 decks of cards.
Like a literal card game.
Yes, the subjects were told to draw cards to win money. But the decks were rigged. Decks A and B gave huge, thrilling payouts, but they also contained massive, devastating financial penalties.
So it's a trap.
If you kept drawing from them, you would go bankrupt. Deck C and D, on the other hand, gave small, boring payouts, but the penalties were tiny. It was the safe, sustainable route.
So how do healthy brains handle that?
A healthy brain figures out the pattern remarkably quickly. Even before the person consciously understands the math, their body starts generating a subconscious stress response when they reach for the dangerous decks.
Their internal alarm bells ring.
Exactly, and they naturally shift to the safer decks. But the researchers also tested patients who had physical damage to their ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain directly responsible for weighing future consequences.
And I'm guessing they didn't learn the pattern?
It was worse than not learning. They persistently, almost obsessively, chose the disastrous decks. They chased the massive short-term high of the big payout, utterly blind to the catastrophic long-term penalties.
They couldn't see the future.
They lacked the neurobiology to simulate future regret. And neuroimaging shows that severe behavioral addiction impairs this exact same prefrontal region. The addiction degrades the brain's braking system while simultaneously jamming the accelerator to the floor.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if we accept that a behavior can rewire the brain's hardware, we're faced with a massive philosophical problem. Where does the madness stop?
The boundary problem.
Right. If gambling is an addiction, what about video games? What about scrolling through social media? Aren't we wandering into a territory where psychiatrists are just pathologizing normal human joy? I mean, over 1 billion people play video games worldwide without destroying their lives.
Most people are perfectly fine.
Do we really need to slap a psychiatric label on a teenager who just really loves gaming?
That is the exact debate tearing the psychiatric community apart right now. The fear of definitional creep. If everything that feels good and is done frequently is labeled an addiction, the word loses all clinical meaning.
It just becomes synonymous with liking things a lot.
Exactly. The major global health organizations are actively fighting over where to draw this line.
How so? Like the APA versus the WHO.
Look at the American Psychiatric Association, the APA. In 2013, they finally moved gambling disorder into the official addictions chapter of the DSM. They crossed the Rubicon, but they aggressively hit the brakes right after. When asked to include internet gaming disorder, they refused. They said the evidence wasn't strong enough to distinguish it from intense, enthusiastic behavior and labeled it only as a condition for further study.
But the World Health Organization didn't hit the brakes, did they?
No, they accelerated. In their latest diagnostic manual, the ICD-11, the World Health Organization officially recognized gaming disorder as a full-blown behavioral addiction, right alongside gambling.
Wow.
They argue that for a small minority of players, the neurological takeover and the life destruction are identical. So right now, the two biggest psychiatric classification systems in the world are fundamentally out of sync.
But how do clinicians actually tell the difference? If someone is playing video games for 8 hours a day, how does a doctor know if it's an addiction or just a really intense, poorly managed hobby?
It comes back to the clinical threshold of impairment. It's not about the hours spent, it's about the destruction caused. The diagnosis requires that the behavior results in severe, ongoing impairment in personal, family, social, or occupational
Because
functioning,
they can't stop.
and the person continues, despite those devastating consequences. We also have to explicitly contrast addiction with other psychiatric conditions, like obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, which could look similar on the surface.
Right, because someone with OCD engages in repetitive behaviors, compulsions, which might look like an addiction.
They look similar, but the core engine driving them is entirely different. An OCD compulsion is fundamentally driven by an intense need for anxiety reduction.
Ah, okay.
A person washes their hands repeatedly because they are terrified of contamination. They aren't getting a high, they're trying to stop feeling awful. Addiction, on the other hand, is fundamentally driven by reward seeking. You engage in the behavior to get the dopamine hit, to chase the rush.
And I think it's crucial for you listening to understand that these psychiatric labels are not fixed laws of nature. They are man-made categories that are constantly being revised to match reality.
Very true.
For example, in the older diagnostic manual, one of the criteria for a gambling addiction was that you committed illegal acts like forgery or theft to fund your gambling.
Which used to be common.
But years of clinical data showed that almost no modern gambling addicts were doing that. They were just quietly maxing out legal credit cards and taking out second mortgages. So the psychiatric community dropped the illegal acts requirement entirely, shifting the threshold to reflect how the disorder actually manifests today.
Exactly. Psychiatry is an evolving empirical science. But this evolution can cause a lot of public confusion. We need to clear up some major misconceptions right now, because the clinical terminology has been completely diluted by pop culture.
Yes, you hear colloquial phrases all the time. People say, I have a shopping addiction, or I'm addicted to social media, or they talk about sex addiction. But you have to know that clinically speaking, those are not official psychiatric diagnoses right now.
People use them very casually.
Right. Therapists might use those terms informally to help patients, and people certainly suffer deeply from those compulsions, but they lack the standardized global consensus criteria to be in the major diagnostic manuals.
Right now, the only official behavioral addictions are gambling disorder and, depending on which organization you ask, gaming disorder.
The scientific community has to move slowly and carefully to protect the integrity of the diagnoses. But here is the critical takeaway. While the diagnostic manuals debate the precise labels, the behavioral mechanisms we've discussed are already shaping the modern world you live in.
They really are.
So what does this all mean for you? Why does this deep dive into 1990s research papers and brain scanners matter to your daily life?
It matters because understanding this neurobiology completely destroys the myth of poor willpower. When a person is struggling with compulsive gambling or someone is losing hours of their life to a digital device, telling them to just use more willpower is essentially clinical malpractice.
It just doesn't work.
It fails because the variable ratio format of the game, especially continuous, rapid-cycle electronic machines where you can place a new bet every 3 seconds, is specifically engineered to override the prefrontal cortex. The machine is faster, stronger, and more resilient than human willpower.
And this isn't just about the casino floor anymore. We've brought the casino into our pockets.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, just look at the smartphone you probably have sitting next to you right now. Modern technology, app developers, and social media platforms heavily utilize the exact same variable ratio and near-miss principles pioneered by the gambling industry.
Like the pull to refresh on apps.
Exactly. When you pull your thumb down to refresh your social media feed and the screen pauses for a fraction of a second before delivering new content, that is a slot machine mechanic. It builds anticipation.
You're waiting for the reels to stop.
You don't know if you're going to get an important message from a friend, a hilarious video, or absolutely nothing.
And that unpredictability is the glue that keeps you swiping. It's not that the content is always good. It's that you never know when the good content is coming.
Precisely. This is why modern treatment for behavioral addictions doesn't focus on judging a person's character or telling them to try harder. It focuses on structural interventions and harm reduction.
Because willpower isn't enough.
If you can't rely on...
We also have to acknowledge that some people are biologically more vulnerable to these structural hacks than others. There's fascinating genetic research pointing to a concept called reward deficiency syndrome.
Kenneth Blum's work, yes.
The theory is that some people are born with an underactive baseline reward system, perhaps due to genetic variations in how their brain builds dopamine receptors. A walk in the park or a nice meal doesn't give them the same baseline joy it gives someone
So
else.
their baseline is just lower.
Yeah, so they are genetically predisposed to seek out incredibly intense, highly stimulating behaviors just to feel a normal baseline of satisfaction.
It highlights how deeply physical these seemingly non-physical behaviors truly are. The environment exploits the biology.
Okay, let's run through the core aha moments we've unpacked in this deep dive. 1. Gambling was the pioneer. It forced the rigid medical establishment to finally accept that a behavior, completely independent of a chemical substance, can functionally and biologically act like a drug. 2. Variable ratio schedules. The unpredictable rewards built into slot machines in your social media feeds are literal brain hackers that exploit our evolutionary survival systems.
They absolutely are.
3. The ultimate proof of this neurobiology comes from Parkinson's medications, where adding synthetic dopamine can instantaneously turn a frugal non-gambler into someone who drains their retirement account in a weekend.
The dopamine dysregulation.
And 4, because of all this structural engineering, relying on willpower is completely the wrong framework for dealing with these compulsions.
This raises an important question, one that extends far beyond the psychiatric diagnostic manuals and into the way our society is built.
Oh, definitely.
If behavioral neuroscience has decisively proven that mechanisms like variable ratio schedules and losses disguised as wins actively bypass human willpower to create behavioral addiction, well, at what point does consumer protection law need to start treating app developers and tech platforms the same way we treat casinos or tobacco companies?
Now that is a thought to mull over the next time you reach into your pocket. Think about that glowing screen, that endless swipe, the tiny spin of that loading wheel. It might not be a syringe, but your brain can't always tell the difference. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the design of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.